Good evening. Good evening. My name is Marjorie Gans, and I'm a member of the board of the Writers' Room of Boston. And I'm delighted that you could join us. And if you started with us last week and you're here again, that's wonderful, because tonight we're going to do it. So this is our April reading and our virtual series, Readings from the Room. And it began 1 year ago in March. If you don't know about the Writers' Room, it is a co-working space in downtown Boston for any and all writers, whether you're established or emerging, who want or need a quiet place to write. The room is open 24 hours a day. It provides desks and silence and the quiet companionship of other writers. We've been serving writers of the greater Boston area since 1993. And if you are curious or have any questions, please let us know. We'd be delighted to have new members, and we now have different levels of membership, including a virtual membership for those who can't easily make it to the room. So if you're interested, please contact our program director, Leslie Ostrow, at thewritersroomofboston.org, and that address will be in the chat. In 2022, we launched this new reading series as a way to reach out to the writing community during the pandemic and share the wonderful writing from both established and emerging writers. Some of the readers have called or used to call or now call the Writers' Room home. Some are now from different parts of the country, which is a benefit that we take from Zoom and even the pandemic, I suppose. Tonight we have Hanna Halperin and Doug Brendel. Hanna is a fiction writer and has recently published her debut novel. She teaches at Grub Street. Doug writes a humorous blog and fiction. He is also an actor. As we go along, feel free to use the comments feature in the box, the chat feature in the box at the bottom of the screen, and you can type your questions in there. This series is made possible by grants from the Mass Cultural Council and the Boston Cultural Council, and we also rely on friends. If you enjoy the program, please consider making a contribution using that donate button at the bottom of your screen. We will also be recording this reading, and a replay will be available on the Writers' Room website. We begin the evening with Hanna Halperin. Hanna is a graduate of the MFA program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her stories have been published in the Kenyon Review, N+1, New Ohio Review, Joyland, and others. Her debut novel, Something Wild, won the 2021 Edward Lewis Wallant Award for Jewish American Fiction, and it was a finalist for the 2021 National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction. It was longlisted for the VCU Cabell First Novelist Award. Something Wild is about family, the contradictions of sisterhood, mothers and daughters, and the traumas that trap mothers and daughters in cycles of violence. Hanna teaches fiction workshops at Grub Street in Boston and works as a domestic violence counselor. Her next novel, I Could Live Here Forever, is forthcoming from Viking in the spring of 2023. And you can learn more about Hanna at her website, www.hannahalperin.com. Hanna, it's all yours.
Okay. Can you hear me all right this time?
Yes,
okay.
Thank you.
All right, just type in the chat if anything goes awry. Okay, I'm going to be reading from Something Wild, and I'm going to be reading from the second chapter. And just to give you a bit of context, in this novel, it opens with these two adult sisters, Nessa and Tanya Bloom, and they're going home for the weekend to Arlington, Massachusetts. And they're helping their mother clean out their childhood house because their mother's going to be moving. And that weekend, they discover that their mother is in an abusive marriage with their stepfather, Jesse. And the novel opens, the novel goes back and forth between the two sisters' points of view, Nessa and Tanya. And it also goes into their mother's point of view every once in a while. This chapter is the second chapter, and it's from Nessa's point of view. She's the older sister, and they're adults by this time. Nessa Bloom doesn't believe in God, but when she gets a UTI this severe, sometimes she feels as if she's being punished for something by someone. Sitting on a bus for 4 hours isn't going to help. She would have preferred to drive to Arlington, but Henry persuaded her to lend him her car for the weekend. Marvelous day, her seatmate announces, seemingly to Nessa. Nessa glances over. The woman's face is wide, dappled with age spots, purplish lipstick gathered at the corners of her smile. She smells of clothing that's been sitting in a closet for many years. It is, Nessa agrees. She smiles back, which takes effort considering the pain she's in. Minutes later, the bus pulls out of the depot and starts its journey down Elm Street before merging onto the Mass Pike toward Boston. Nessa gets that familiar rush in her stomach. It's not a purely bad sensation exactly, the wild thing, but it's unsettling, and paired with the UTI, it produces a feeling of intense homesickness in Nessa. Nessa returns more frequently than Tanya. It's not often that they go back to Arlington together, to the house they grew up in, and this will be the last time they ever do. Nessa crosses her legs together and squeezes. She glances behind her at the awful little restroom at the back of the bus, wonders how long she'll be able to hold out before going back there. The woman next to her will probably get suspicious after Nessa's third or so trip. She'll think it's drugs or maybe just diarrhea. At the very least, Nessa is grateful not to be sitting next to a cute guy or any guy at all. Nessa resists the urge to text Tanya again, even with an update on the UTI. Instead, she texts Henry. Did you make it to Dr. Janeski's on time? She stares at her phone. He is the type to either respond immediately or not for hours, sometimes days later. When 10 minutes goes by with no response, she tucks her phone into a pocket of her backpack and leans her head against the darkened glass window and closes her eyes. Nessa met Henry at Dr. Janeski's, and she knows she has to end things with him soon if she wants to keep her job with the psychiatrist. But despite Henry's clumsiness in bed, despite the gruff way he handles her, her body, and her emotions, she looks forward to seeing him. It started a month ago when Nessa bumped into Henry at the bus stop on the corner of Main Street.
Alexa, stop.
At first, Nessa couldn't place him. She recognized his camo hoodie, his posture slumped. He was tall, well over 6 feet, but he stood as if he was in a room with low ceilings, even though he was outside. It was Henry Alden from Dr. Janeski's office, she realized, as he flicked ash from his cigarette. As she approached, she waited for Henry to notice her, but he didn't until she was standing right in front of him. He gave her a funny smile, as if to say, "Do I know you?" "Henry, right?" she said. He nodded, still smiling. "Nessa," she said, "I'm the receptionist at Dr. Janeski's office." "Oh," he said, nodding. Right. His eyes jumped from her face down her body. "You waiting for the bus?" Nessa nodded, even though she was only a few blocks from home, no more than an 8-minute walk. "You too?" "Yep." "Can I bum one?" she asked. Henry reached into his back pocket and pulled out a pack of Camels and held it out for her. For a moment, they stood smoking, not talking, and Nessa could feel Henry looking at her. She thought back to Henry's file in the office and tried to remember what was written there. She'd been the one to create the file, to make photocopies of Henry's insurance card, write Alden in capital letters on the tab, put a hole punched intake sheet in the front of the file for Janeski to take notes on during the initial consultation. He'd been arrested that fall for stealing a taxi, she remembered then. It was his parents, who were housing and feeding him, who insisted he see a psychiatrist. Anxiety, Dr. Janeski had written in the diagnosis section. Janeski used an inky ballpoint pen to take notes, her spidery lettering like eyelashes clumped with too much mascara. But Nessa didn't think Henry seemed anxious. It was inappropriate that she approached him, a HIPAA violation. And if Dr. Janeski found out, she'd be angry. It was probably the type of thing Nessa could get fired for. Henry pulled out his phone and glanced at it. "The bus was supposed to be here 10 minutes ago," he said. "I fucking hate the bus." "Yeah," she said. "You don't have a car?" "I do," he said. "My license was revoked, though." He rolled his eyes and smiled at her, and she thought he had a nice smile. "I get it back in 6 weeks." "Why'd it get revoked?" she asked. "You're gonna think I'm crazy." "I won't," she promised. I was really wasted, he started. There was this taxi sitting there. It was over on Spring Street. He pointed in the direction of Spring Street. The driver had gotten out, was helping this old lady carry her bags up the stairs. He left the car unlocked and running, and I got in and drove away. He smiled, bashful and proud at the same time. Why'd you do that? Nessa asked, smiling. I have no clue, he said. It was stupid. I had to spend the night in jail, and now I have to rely on fucking public transportation. I can give you a ride home if you want. He raised his eyebrows. Yeah? We just have to walk to my apartment, but it's not very far. Sweet, Henry said. They walked down Main Street, and Nessa liked the feeling of walking next to somebody so tall. It made her feel small and delicate, two things Nessa rarely felt. She'd been living in Northampton for 2 years, and she knew that tangle of streets around her home well. The uneven sidewalks, the houses painted unusual colors, like lilac, pale green, sunny yellow, the gardens out front, which were just beginning to bloom again. But walking with Henry, she saw everything afresh. This is me, she said, turning into her driveway where her car was parked. She lived alone in the upstairs of a small house. The owners lived downstairs with their Doberman. This is where you live? Henry asked, looking the house up and down the same way he'd looked at her 15 minutes before. Nessa nodded and clicked her fob, unlocking the car. For a moment, they both stood by the car, Nessa on the driver's side and Henry by the passengers, though neither one of them got in. What's it like inside? Henry asked. Do you want to see? Nessa said, and Henry nodded. Since then, they'd met up once or twice a week to have sex. Usually, Henry spent the night and Nessa would drive him back to his parents' house in the morning. He was one of Janeski's psychopharm patients. He came in twice a week for a Xanax prescription, and that was it. No talk therapy, so there was little chance of his sex life coming up. And he had promised Nessa he wouldn't say a word. But Dr. Janeski was smart, and Nessa was easy to read. For his last appointment, Nessa hid in the bathroom on Thursday morning when Henry was scheduled, so she wouldn't be in the waiting room when Dr. Janeski came to get him. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if she was fired, she reasoned. She had been at it for 2 years now, and the job had gotten old. Nessa answered the phone, faxed in prescriptions, managed the billing. It was fine, mostly boring, with brief bouts of excitement. And Henry, with his boyish eyes and incredible height, had been the latest bout. What do you think of Dr. Janeski? She'd asked Henry the night before in bed. She's nice, he'd said, shrugging. And it occurred to Nessa that Henry didn't care about his psychiatrist, what he thought of her or what she thought of him. After she slept with Henry the first time, she'd revisited his file on several occasions. He was 33, 3 years older than her, and worked as a landscaper. He'd been fired from most of his jobs, usually for coming to work drunk or high. Growing up, he got in trouble at school and was diagnosed incorrectly with ADHD. According to a prior school psychologist who'd faxed over notes, when Henry was 8, his mother left the family unannounced and came back a year later with a mysterious burn on her arm and the word respect tattooed on the inside of her bottom lip. These details touched Nessa, not because of Henry's mother, but because they were things Henry noticed and thought about and said out loud. Someday, when she has the money, Nessa will go to therapy. She understands herself well enough to know that she's probably a little mentally ill. She doesn't hear voices or anything like that. She's just sad a lot of the time, most of the time. Not that you'd know it necessarily by looking at her. And I will stop there.